Welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm your host, Don Watkins. My guest today is Mark Pellegrino. You probably know him as Jacob in the TV show Lost or Lucifer on the show Supernatural. But Mark is also one of the most thoughtful people I know on philosophy and politics. In fact, we met because I saw this guy on Twitter a few years ago mention my second book, Roosevelt Care, which is a critique of Social Security and the welfare state. And he was making arguments that were in the book, but almost better than I did in the book. And so in this interview, Mark and I talk about his journey from environmentalist to capitalist, his experiences in Hollywood, and the trials and tribulations of defending controversial ideas online. Speaking of controversial, we also talk briefly about why we believe anarchism shouldn't be seen as part of the liberty movement. Let me say a quick word on that point, because I know that some of you may be at least sympathetic to anarchism. Now, I've never been sympathetic to it. I've never been sympathetic to anarchism emotionally, but there was definitely a time when I found some of the arguments made by people like Murray Rothbard or David Friedman or Michael Huemer plausible, if not fully convincing. And the main thing that eliminated all of that confusion for me was studying history and realizing that for much of history, politics was a struggle to avoid anarchy. Liberty is not a default. It's not what exists when governments aren't around to take it away. It's really an achievement, and it's a slow move from tribal warfare to order, from order to law, from law to law is based on individual rights. And every step of that achievement is an improvement on what came before. It allows for more stability and long-range action, which we need to flourish. And that's why you'd see even people who, by our standards, were incredibly unfree, cling to governments that were keeping them from that kind of anarchy and chaos. Now, modern anarchists, they love to talk about pirates and Iceland, but the actual examples of anarchy are examples of social breakdown and savage gang warfare. That is not freedom. Freedom is the triumph of the rule of law, limited government, and the subordination of force to moral law, specifically the principle of individual rights. In the show notes, I'm going to share a few resources on this point, and I hope you find them helpful. Some final notes. This is actually the first interview I recorded for the podcast on May 22nd, 2020, what I hope are the final weeks of the COVID-19 lockdowns. And in general, I don't want to date these podcasts because I think we're dealing with universal issues. But this was, I decided to leave it in because I want this show to feel very real. I want it to be conversations between real people. And B, I also wanted a small reminder of what life was like during what I hope are the final weeks of the COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, this is a small, trivial, and very cute inconvenience, but I wanted to be able to look back and remember that how disruptive it was to have the mass deprivation of freedom that the lockdowns posed. Finally, let me discuss briefly two ways that you can support the show. So number one is go to donswriting.com and sign up for my email list. I'll keep you up to date on important news about the show, but also share my latest thinking about how to win hearts and minds for liberty. You'll also get my week-long Persuasion Bootcamp email series, which is the best insights I've learned over 20 years of arguing for liberty. And second, you can support this show for as little as 99 cents a month by clicking the anchor link in the show notes. All of that money goes to improve this show and grow the audience. So if you value this podcast, it's a great way to get the message out. Now, on to the conversation. So thanks for doing this. The kind of impetus is, there's a lot of interest, I think, in how do we actually win hearts and minds for freedom? And I think one mistake is that people tend to generalize from their own experience. But there's kind of a flip side to that mistake, which is I don't think we learned enough from our own experience. Like, we are people who've been convinced that freedom and capitalism are good. And like, my conviction is that if we really drill down into that, there's a lot we can learn about how to be better at promoting those ideas. And, you know, you're somebody who's been very outspoken in favor of freedom. And like, we've never talked about this, but my understanding is that is not where you started.
Right. It's true. Yeah, no, I started as a Democrat through and through. I don't think I've ever been registered as anything other than a Democrat until about 5 years ago, when I declined to state, and then started my own political party. But until that time, I was a registered Democrat, and then just voted however I wanted to. But
So how did you end up starting there? Like, what got you interested in politics, and what pointed you in that direction?
Yeah, so I was nurtured in state schools, and in the 70s, they, I think, started inserting environmentalist curriculum into our studies, and getting us as sixth graders and fifth graders to debate issues like gun control and banning nuclear energy and all that stuff, with the premises that it's appropriate to control the citizens' access to firearms. It's appropriate to ban nuclear power, and it's appropriate to behave in all the sort of right ways that environmentalists were setting out. And so I became an environmentalist, and I got interested in politics by way of environmentalism. And when Reagan came into office, I thought it was the end of the world, and I wrote I think I was 15 or 16. I wrote to the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Watts, I think his name was, who I thought for sure was going to destroy all of our natural resources because they were doing evil things like, you know, putting the economy first. I wrote them a massive letter for a 15-year-old on the Aleutian Island ceiling, and they sent me back a environmental impact study like this, and with all kinds of economic impacts. It was all about how those poor people actually needed to seal in order to live. I didn't care about that, so I didn't even read their economic and environmental impact report. I just barreled on ahead, joined environmental groups, protested, wrote letters when I could, and that sort of informed my politics, which, you know, my mom was sort of she was sort of a liberal, I guess, what's his name? Unsafe at Any Speed, that guy, Ralph Nader type liberal, armchair politician who would sort of rant on liberal causes. And so that was sort of my beginning political education, and very vague, very general sentiments that I followed, and followed me.
How would you have thought about why people disagreed with you at the time? Like, if somebody had said, well, why doesn't everybody agree with you, Mark? What would have been your sense of the opposition?
Well, to me, the opposition was uncaring. I think unconsciously I held sympathy and concern as my moral guides. And if you were unconcerned about something like the environment, for example, it demonstrated a lack of sympathy, lack of empathy, and an inability to sort of step down to things that didn't have control over their own lives, and rather than manage them, to destroy them and exploit them. And I thought that represented an evil mindset. And there was really no, I mean, when I would have conversations with this objectivist friend of mine, and I met in theater school, we would talk till 5 o'clock in the morning, and at times he would say the most horrific things to me at the time, like, I think we're going to use up all the resources on this planet and move to another one. I was just blown away by that kind of callousness. Now, I don't know that he would approach those same issues today the way he did back then. I think we know so much more about what constitutes a resource and how much there really is, and how nearly infinite we can make these resources. But it was a shocking sentiment to me, and exactly the opposite of what I thought. You know, I think also I had a very concrete, bound sense of things. I know that's sort of an objectivist term, but you know, you see things as finite. This is a truth even objectivists acknowledge, right? The universe is finite, but that means that we must come to an end of the, you know, these things have to end. And there's no sense that American or human ingenuity can bridge the gap between the end of that resource and the beginning of another one. There's just a sense of an end, of finiteness, and that we're going to that humans are rapacious, and they're going to exploit and suck all the life out of the world, and then crap it out the other end, and there'll be nothing left but waste. And look, I mean, I wasn't far from the environmentalist leaders at the time who really looked at human beings as a cancer on the world, right? I think I unconsciously and somewhat consciously held that point of view. I admired an animal perception more than the human capacity to perceive and integrate rationally. To me, that in that distance between the perceptual animal and the conceptual animal was the capacity for untruth and brutality, right?
Yeah.
All those things that we associate with, most artists associate with humanity today.
So what do you remember? What was the first thing that either made you start to become skeptical of your old framework or be open to a new one?
Well, the theater company that I joined
How old were you?
in the late, I was 22. So ideas are formed, you know, pretty much. Your sense of life is there. It's formed. But I had the mentor, the founder of my theater company, happened to be a social and fiscal conservative, and he was outspoken about it at the time. Um, and he exposed me to conservative ideas, and so I started listening to talk radio, and then started reading conservative thinkers and subscribing to publications like the Conservative Chronicle and what else? What's that other conservative magazine that's sort of big? Do you know what I'm
National
talking about?
Review.
National Review. Started subscribing to the National Review, and I actually found a great deal of sympathy with that point of view in a lot of areas, not all, but I found them to be more grounded in reason, even though I wouldn't have said that at the time. It just seemed more sound to me, and I started to drift in that direction in my early to mid 20s, and that's
So
when,
just to
yeah.
back up for a second. So what was it that was this just, somebody you admired was talking about ideas that, you had never considered before, and it was the fact that you admired him, or do you remember him making certain points that you thought, yeah, I don't have an answer for that, or that's intriguing?
It was more the second thing. The Conservative Chronicle is just a bunch of syndicated editorials from syndicated columnists like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. And when I started reading these guys, I mean, when you read Thomas Sowell, flaws and assumptions aside, he makes very profound observations about the way things are, and I wasn't getting that same kind of profundity from the left. And his arguments were sort of unassailable. They're Mark Twain-esque in their brilliance, in their economy, and in the amount that they said in that economy. And I was sort of blown away by that. And I really couldn't find I couldn't combat the things he was saying. I didn't have the capacity to do it at the time, and so that I found the arguments overwhelming in a good way, and that's what started to sway me to that side.
Yeah, the
It was
thing
it was common sense, really. It was just relating to my whatever common sense I still had left in me that hadn't been destroyed by the school system.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always found very powerful about Soul in particular, because he was somebody I was attracted to when I was quite young, was he does two things that I think are really hard to do, but really powerful when you perceive them. One is that he takes, like, he challenges certain concepts and like words that we use. So this is, Ayn Rand does this more than anybody, but like, he would take a concept like sustainability and make you think, does this make any sense at all? Like, is it actually sustainable to ruin an economy? And isn't it sustainable to have continual innovation where, yeah, we can't do something over and over forever, but we can, do one thing really well and then do an even better thing, and so on. And then the other thing that he'll do is he'll take a claim and then test it and say, like, is there a way to, is this consistent with the facts? So like, I remember one point he made, and set aside whether this is a fully convincing case, but at least made a big impression on me when I was young. He would make certain points about, there's claims that it's systemic racism holding American blacks back. And he would say, well, what do we see when we look at the statistics for African immigrant blacks? And he would say, like, we're not seeing the same low income. And so can we ascribe it to race? And I think as as I've kind of progressed in my thinking, I think you can at least push back against that argument more than I thought you could back then. But that kind of focus on, let's take the argument and let's actually examine, look for counter examples, was really powerful.
Yeah, it widens the context. I think one of the things that the left does is they focus on one particular aspect of a problem. There's no question that systemic racism has really hobbled the lives of African Americans. But it's not the whole picture. And so what I think Thomas Sowell does is he opens up the forum so that you see a broader context. So it's like, oh, it's not just this, but there's also this factor and this factor and this factor and this factor, and that takes the onus off of what eventually becomes, ingrained political prejudices or a certain type of policy formation, and puts it onto individual accountability, and it just widens the scope of responsiveness. And I think he made that really clear when, I mean, one of the most impactful things I remember reading was, I think, in the book The Anointed. I'm having like multiple senior moments. What is it called?
I can never. Oh, The Vision of the Anointed.
The vision of the Anointed. He was calling out Ralph Nader for his book Unsafe at Any Speed, and how the progressives just focused on one narrow flaw in this engine design and threw away all the other alternatives that could possibly induce somebody to actually pick that car. It handled better because of the rear drive. It had all these other advantages that somebody could say, this is good, and I'm willing to risk this small problem based on these other alternatives. So I think he got me to see that some perspectives, especially when they're so narrow, rob a person of moral agency and authority, and sort of divest it to the state, as opposed to investing it in yourself when you have a wider context and see, my life is about alternatives and I choose based on those alternatives. You know what I'm saying? Am I making any sense?
No, absolutely. So now you've started to go in this journey, and was there, I have a hypothesis, and maybe you can tell me whether it fits or doesn't fit you, which is that whenever we actually, usually we have our kind of standard way of looking at the world, and sometimes that'll be thrown into doubt. Like, you'll have a conversation and somebody come up with an argument you can't answer, but then either, life goes on, or you forget about it, or you look it up and you find you disagree. But when you're actually undergoing a change, the kind of first part of it is you're looking for reasons to disagree with it, right? Here's a new framework that seems appealing. You're like, well, let me see, where are the holes? How does it account for this? How does it account for that? But then you tend to reach a certain point where now this framework you think makes a lot of sense. And so you're more looking, not in a dishonest way, how do I prove this framework? But you're in a more sympathetic way saying, okay, this framework is really clarifying, how does it account for this question that I haven't considered yet? And, people make this argument I was always convinced by. I suspect there's probably a flaw in it. And so sort of persuasion becomes something very difficult, and then it becomes something that the person is sort of actively pursuing on their own.
That sounds like an accurate description of the way things are.
So what was your sort of journey? Do you remember there came a point where you thought, yeah, I don't look at the world as a Democrat anymore. Or what were kind of some signposts that you hit?
I mean, first of all, I think a lot of people go through a seeking period in their life when they're particularly open to philosophy in their mid to late teens. And I was fortunate enough to go through it at that time, but also to continuously go through it. So I never stopped. You know, I never cemented an idea as the one I was going to get behind until much later. And I don't know what processes, I don't know what aspects of my life made that way of adopting ideas peculiar to me. It could be that I had I had a fractured home. I had no one telling me what was right or wrong. I had to sort of decipher that for myself, and that became a lifelong habit. Um, I can't say that everybody is like that, though. You know, don't you think some people adopt an idea, it becomes sort of solidified, and then from there they don't necessarily turn around unless they've got that epistemological gear already in place. For me, I didn't start to. I didn't admit. I don't think I ever admitted that I had conservative sympathies until recently, when I look back on it and said, "Oh yeah, I think I can." I would find myself defending conservative ideas from time to time, but not consciously, never consciously giving in. I couldn't say I was a conservative. Um, but in my mid 20s, particularly after reading Rand, I mean, I definitely felt a change in the way I began to look at the world. And I think it was when I started to look at something man-made as not artificial anymore, and I felt um, a sense of joy at looking at something. I remember flying over somewhere and seeing a mountain range and a road going straight through the mountain range and going, "Ooh, yeah, you know, that's our fingerprint on nature," and I think that's beautiful. And that sounds like it took a long time for me to get to that point. I think some people imitate, you know, the objectivist thing. They you know, I found nature beautiful and man-made things ugly. And once I started seeing man-made things as beautiful for other reasons, once those values became an unconscious part of my life, then I began to notice the transition. So that had to be somewhere in my mid 20s to early 30s, maybe.
To what extent was sort of your, peer group uh, a factor that you were at least aware of, even if you didn't allow it to influence your thinking in terms of the ideas you held?
I mean, there was only one dude that I knew who was an objectivist, and he was a weird guy and totally antisocial and majorly messed up in lots of ways. Everybody else, mostly in my Hollywood world, um, were on the left, and my mentor was a bizarre brand of Christian. I don't even know what sect he belongs to, but he's sort of a preacher. So I had nobody in my world, um, really nobody in my world that believed or thought that the way I did and influenced me to move forward beyond that one person. And he was helpful in a lot of ways. But after that, I felt like it was me influencing other people around me, because I became a teacher at this studio and started using the bully pulpit of teaching to insert these ideas into the technique and to start troubling students by offering them alternative worldviews.
I mean, it's really
So
interesting because, I mean, I actually relate to that quite a bit. I mean, I discovered Ayn Rand when I was 14 or 15 and didn't meet anybody else. My son has apparently worked his way into the studio, i.e. Landon, I need you to go downstairs. Okay, well, I think you need to go downstairs. Yeah, so I discovered Ayn Rand when I was 14 or 15 and didn't meet anybody else who agreed with it until I was, I think, 19 or so. And I don't remember it actually ever bothering me, but I know a lot of people find it very traumatizing when sort of their peer group and the people that they spend time with or the people that they work with, when they have ideas that kind of put them in conflict with them. And what do you think is different about you that either didn't bother you or didn't stop you at least from um, focusing on what, yeah, I'm going to base my ideas based on my best assessment of what's true rather than what gains me acceptance.
I think it bothers me that I'm bothered by it, because I am bothered by it. It's really hard to go against the grain when the rest of the world is saying one thing and you're like, I can't go there. I'm sorry. And the rest of the world isn't kind about their differences with you. They're abusive and cruel. And now we have cancel culture, which didn't exist in the late '80s, early '90s when I was coming into these ideas freshly, fresh and new. So now if people disagree with you, they try to undo your life. They try to eliminate you from the argument entirely. And that is very stressful. I'm not a giant like Rourke, where it just rolls off my back. It's meaningless to me. It is meaningful to me, but I can't give in. And in fact, the more they attack me, the more I dig in and punch back. Not because I'm stubborn or have something to prove, but I think we're at a crossroads in our society right now where we're set to go one way or the other. And we're tipping towards one direction. There seems to be a mass sentiment heading in sort of the statist authoritarian, let's give up control of our lives and moral accountability to the state. And lots of people believe that. And it is lonely, really lonely, being one of the lone voices in Hollywood who is neither a liberal nor a conservative, but something else. I think there are starting to be smatterings of other people through Dave Rubin, who are starting to classify themselves in another way. I don't know if Dave got that from me, but I think I was the first person to call myself a classical liberal on his show. From then, it seems to have grown a little bit, and I hope that gets some purchase. But I just see tremendous hostility against us, and it's disturbing.
What's been your experience on a one-to-one level talking with people in your industry? Because I mean, my experience, I mean, I spent a little time in Hollywood, but obviously nothing like you. I mean, my experience is generally, if you're a decent person, one-on-one, there's usually not a problem with most people discussing ideas. It tends to be more when people are worried about how they're being judged by other people.
Mm.
That there is animosity. To what extent does that resonate or not with your experience?
I find most people one-on-one to be very receptive to these ideas. Even the ones who had preconceived notions of what objectivism was, once you actually start talking to them about the ideas, they see that, oh, I was wrong. Here it's something else. And this is actually quite interesting. And it actually sort of merges with some of my thinking about the wider context of things. So I find them very receptive. And because I think objectivists can articulate pretty much any problem in a in a better way than pretty much every pundit out there, in a more fundamental way. They can grasp what is at the root of most issues better than anyone out there. It's surprising when they're introduced to that type of thinking. It's surprising to other people in a good way, and so they give you props for being a thoughtful and intelligent person, and for turning something on its head in such a way that they never understood it before, and it opens up their lives. And I think they generally are very appreciative of that. And you're right. I think it comes when when there's social pressure, and when they want, you know, they're more attuned to those social pressures than me, or they're more worried about the effect of those social pressures. I'm worried about them too, but I say fuck it. I need to do what I have to do, and social pressures be damned. I still have to live with myself at the end of the day. But they're less they're less inclined to behave in that way. I'm not saying they have less integrity, but they're just less inclined to behave that way and to let the pressure get to them and to sway. So I could see how they can become panicked in that mode and not be able to think. That such that there's social media. That's social media in a nutshell.
Yeah, I've called myself off of everything but Facebook, and for me, it's mostly a time sink. I mean, my anonymity is, I mean, in terms of ideas, that ship has sailed long ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, that option's not even on the table, but what do you remember what initially was the major thing that appealed to you about Ayn Rand's ideas or her approach?
I don't remember the strongest memory I have of encountering Rand was finishing the Fountainhead. I just got on a bus and I finished Fountainhead at the end of the bus line. I got off the end of the bus line somewhere by Shoup Avenue in Victory, way up there. And there was a big sort of park divide between the highway. I got out to the middle of this park and I laid down and I just bawled hysterically. But it wasn't like, oh my God, I've been liberated by this book. It was, I see some of myself in Rourke. I see some of myself in Keating. How can I bridge the gap? Because it doesn't look like there's a way to bridge the gap. It looks like Keating is sort of bent on going down this one path and not turning around. And Rourke is sort of just, there was sort of a determinism to me in the characters that was disturbing. And I felt a lack of plasticity, like my personality won't be flexible enough to bridge the gap. I'll be forever torn between this artist and this social metaphysician type, and I'll constantly be sort of a neurotic, and there'll be no cure for me. And that's my strongest impression of Rand. I mean, later on, it was just later on, and when my first reading of Rourke too, I found him to be cold and isolated. It was my second reading of The Fountainhead where I found him to be the only person really capable of love, and I saw his generosity and where that generosity came from. So I clearly evolved from the first time I read it to the second time, and but I can't remember now, other than impressions of characters and how they broke me down a little bit, what specific ideas I encountered that moved me out of the realm of being a complete leftist. It was more of a saturation of all of her entire philosophy of egoism, rational egoism, is sort of washing over me and saying, yes, this is correct. This is the way to look at the world. I don't know that I'd pieced it all together at that time. It was just what do they call it? A felt sense, when something turns in you, it's not identified yet, but you have a sort of an epiphany, a little epiphany. I remember walking down the street and just looking at life being conscious of looking at life in a different way. I didn't know why I enjoyed breathing and I enjoyed the sunlight on my face. And it could have been the first time I'd ever given myself permission to be a sensual being. I don't know.
What were you doing kind of existentially in terms during that period? Like, were you reading a lot of her novels, or were you listening to a lot of lectures, or was it just something that was floating in the back of your mind?
I was reading a lot because my theater company encouraged reading, and so I was reading a lot of different things, and Rand was just sort of part of my own particular curriculum. It wasn't recommended in any of the book recommendations for our class. But I was definitely widening my consciousness and exposing it to lots of different ways of looking at the world. And I was acting. I was learning an acting technique, and a part of learning the technique is it's very exploratory. You have to look inward when you're coming up with exercises to work on your acting, or when you're trying to find parallel circumstances for scripts. you have to do a lot of inward searching and journaling and thinking about the type of person that you are, and imagination work, and that led me to therapy, and going to therapy and just figuring out what, all this is about. So I mean, it feels like just a confluence of 50 different forces, converging on me at once. It's
That's
like the pressure of water through a hole just sort of pushes you. You just got to go that way.
That's
You know what I
interesting. I
mean?
mean, I was going to ask you about acting, but I was thinking about it from the other side. I haven't taken much in the way of acting classes. I read a little bit, mostly for the purposes of writing, but I was thinking more along the lines of persuasion. So in persuasion, like, you really need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who doesn't already see the world the way that you do. And so I was thinking of like the parallel to acting being more able to sympathize and empathize with, another, with a character who is seeing the world differently. To what extent do you think that is a skill set that's useful to you, either in your own thinking, but more, I mean, because you've been very active in trying to persuade others. I mean, it sounds like you've always been that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sidney Pollack, the famous director, had said that the reason he thinks people, actors in particular, lean to the left politically is because they're feelers and they're used to empathizing with characters in their scripts to such a degree that sort of becomes their primary means of assessing the world. I find it interesting that they can't seem to empathize with conservatives. They can't seem to empathize with objectivists. I think because to a degree, conservatives and to the widest degree, objectivists put something other than emotions first, and they don't understand that. I don't know if my capacity to empathize was sharpened by acting, and as a result, I sort of understood, objectivist principles better. I couldn't say that. I think it's. I think. I think my life, from the time I was young, I've always been a seeker. I've always been sort of philosophical, and always wanted answers, and approached life all the time in an open sort of forum way, and liked arguing and liked talking about ideas and liked figuring out through that argumentation what idea was better. I even online, when I'm in social media, I'm still challenging ideas to see if there's something in those other ideas that work. If there's something in it that well, it's the opposite of what I think, but what is it good? And if so, why? If not, why not? Um,
Well, that's
so
how,
I
I mean,
think,
I became aware of you. I mean, I had seen you in Supernatural. I hadn't watched Lost in those days. But in terms of knowing that you were interested in ideas, as I saw you arguing on Twitter about Social Security and referencing a book that I had written, I was very impressed with how well you were able to like articulate the arguments. And it was definitely, this was a person not regurgitating something they had heard. It was somebody who took what they heard and really processed it and thought about it for themselves. But the other thing that impressed me was usually there's kind of two default methods of arguing that people fall into. One is sort of like an appeasing, like, oh, could you consider this? I know it's controversial. And it's kind of like you're apologizing for holding ideas that most people reject. And then the other is to be overbearing and kind of aggressive about it. Like, don't you see this? Like, you're you're for tyranny if you don't appreciate that we should get rid of the welfare state. And you had this kind of confident posture, but not like, there was no hint of condescension. And I wonder, is that something that you've cultivated consciously, or is that just, you think, related to how you generally approach people and ideas?
I think I generally approach people and ideas that way. I seek to challenge what their thinking is, in part, not to win, but in part to see if what I think is true. So I'm sort of challenging both of us at the same time. They don't know it. They just think I'm challenging them. And I think that when you're challenging to test your own ideas, uh, you are you're just sort of better in the argument. You know what I mean? You're more open. You're more confident because you're not threatened by new information coming in, and so you're not attacking the other person because you're treating them as a person who can teach you something potentially. Either they teach you that your truth is you should be more confirmed in your truth, or you should give it up, and that's good. You now understand that it's something more true than what you did before, and so there's no reason to get upset, right? Because you're a better person either way. But I've also been the opposite. I've been very intense with some people, but they have to bring that out of me. They have to be rude, and they have to be crass. And when they do that, I have no mercy. I
Right.
just I cut them open and let their entrails fall on the floor. And I like beating up bullies. I don't always come out the other side of it well in the eyes of the people who are watching the conversation, but I'm also usually never crass. I just make fun of them until they can't take it anymore. Um, but it's not the ideal way to win an argument for sure, because a lot of people see that and that goes on and becomes a part of the narrative against you.
Yeah.
You don't win points in the long run for for slapping people.
Yeah, I mean, in general, my view is that like debating per se is, I mean, there can be reasons to do it, but it's seldom what convinces people. Although the first person who ever came up to me and said, "Oh, you convinced me of objectivism," I used to get in these long debates with this Catholic kid in high school, and we would just go on for about an hour and a half a day because my journalism class over was long and over coincided with lunch. And there's this kid who I didn't even know who just sat there silently for like 6 months and never said a word. And then just one day it was like, oh, I think you're right. But as a general rule, like when you're arguing, I think one of the reasons people will get worked up and upset, although this isn't the only reason, um, is because they're kind of arguing in order to have a certain image of themselves confirmed. Like I'm the guy who's right, or I'm smarter than others, or something like that. And so when you can have that orientation that you're talking about of like, I want to put my ideas to the test so I can find out if I'm right. It keeps you much more connected to the truth. What To what extent have you gotten feedback that, hey, Mark, I really thought about things in a different way? And has it been more from people watching you debate, or has it been more from your kind of teaching or one-on-one conversations with people?
I've had a lot of people who are influenced by the things I say on social media. Some people have told me that it's changed their lives entirely. That they now finally feel worth it. That's a tremendously powerful thing. For somebody to have come from deep depression, sense of worthlessness and purposelessness, to I matter, and now I want to live. Wow, that's an enormous thing. And they got that all from a few of us who choose to stand as the sort of vanguard for a reason, to fight these skeptics on social media, and they find, wow, those ideas really are empty, and this objectivist thing might have something to it. And yeah, why shouldn't I be happy? Lots of people have come to me and said that, and that makes me feel good. It makes it feel like the fight is worth it. By the same token, I think in the last 3 months, I've lost close to 8,000 followers, and every 2 days or so, my my following goes down 100, 200. It hasn't gone up in 2 months. Now I don't know if it's the situation that is making people less open to philosophical argument, because that's what mostly goes on my page, whether I'm involved in it or not. Um, if Twitter is finding my page controversial and is calling my following a little bit, or if some of those people who don't like me are actually going behind the scenes and spreading more stupid lies about me. But I'm experiencing a dip, and there's two parts of me going, who fucking cares? Whoever's here is going to be here for me, and is going to be here because these ideas are true. And fuck it, the people, let them go their way. But then there's that other part of me that goes, wow, I really need a platform. I really need something wider. And it sucks that my Instagram is so huge because there's nothing deep on there. And that Twitter, there's actually, people are actually really having deep conversations about ideas and how to look at the world, and it's falling. It doesn't give me hope for the world when I see that. Whatever the cause is, I can't see anything good.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'd be really interested in, like, I mean, that, I think that's one of the hard things is when you're getting a consequence out in the world, like you're getting feedback and no way to assess what the meaning of that feedback is, right? Because it's not like you
Yeah.
can run a test where, all right, you could spend 6 weeks now becoming the biggest champion of locking everybody up to fight the pandemic and see, oh, is it growing or something? I mean, I guess you could run that test, but it would be a big it would have its own set of problems. So it becomes, I think, mysterious. Um, what is your impression broadly of sort of the pro freedom movement and its ability to win over supporters?
I think they have an uphill battle because the media enjoys portraying the pro-freedom movement as the redneck Neanderthals of our society. And they're sort of helped in that by a lot of the optics that are out there. And the media does a successful job of marginalizing these people and making them appear to be anti-intellectual, while the left are embracing science, simply science. Um, and with the emergence of scientism and the sort of priesthood of scientists that we're supposed to follow without thinking at all, I see a massive step away from liberty. To be honest with you, I thought something like this would demonstrate to people just how inept the state was at handling pretty much anything, and how federalism could probably be a better take on it, and certainly free enterprise. I thought the deregulations would show people how much they impede and restrict creative energy. I don't know that it's had that effect though. Overall, there's a part of me that appreciates the liberty movement, even the crazy optic stuff, like standing on the Capitol steps with an AK-47. I've argued for that as bad as that appears to people, that it makes me feel like, oh, there's still a sense of life in a part of America that resists arbitrary authority and will stand up against it. It just looks so dumb. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know how. When the left controls the majority of the visual media, you're going to get these optics that just put the liberty movement in a really, really bad place that nobody can take seriously. How do you fight that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've thought about because I mean, with this issue in particular, because I was very heartened when I heard that, oh, people were protesting. And then I saw the pictures. I think it was one of the early ones, maybe Michigan. But then there were people, first of all, being unnecessarily close to each other, which even if you think that it's relatively safe to do that in the outdoors, it's you want to think about what am I portraying, and if I'm trying to hold the scientific high ground and just say like what I'm saying is I take this disease seriously, but we need to be free to deal with it as free people making responsible decisions. Like the optics are bad, as you pointed out, but then it was also you had people holding Confederate flags and like really obnoxious, evil ideas. And it's I would not want to be associated with that and would be horrified if I was associated by that. And of course, as if you think in terms of a protest, you can't control the messaging, even if you organize a protest. And so you'd want to think like, what can people who value freedom do that is impactful, more than just kind of signing a petition or writing a Facebook post, but that doesn't open you up to that. And I don't have great answers. My idea had been, fill up dump trucks with copies of the Constitution and have them dump them in the governor's driveway. But the it's the standard left wing playbook doesn't exactly work when the left is able to use the media to take those outlying ideas and blow them up into this, is represents and should discredit our opposition.
It also doesn't help that the liberty movement is contaminated by anarchists. I mean, that's a scary thought to me, is that people think liberty means doing whatever you want, right? I mean, we just saw a viral video of a guy walking into Walmart saying, "I ain't gonna wear a mask because it's my right. I don't have to wear a mask if I don't want to." And the Walmart employee says, "Get the heck out of our store. It's store policy. Get out." Or it's Costco or something. I forget what it was. But I mean, that anarchist notion of liberty that's unbound by values, unbound by reason, that's how can you take that seriously? But I mean, so many of the intellectuals in the liberty movement buy it, right? I mean, objectivists are outliers to me with respect to the way they look at liberty.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think in part it's the there's a certain appeal in objectivism. There's this concept called rationalism, which is the idea of like ideas detached from reality, and there's a certain appeal and simplicity to saying like, well, I'm just, I'm for freedom and therefore I'm against all restrictions. Like there's a certain seeming consistency and principledness to it. And then, I mean, they have even more sophisticated arguments of, well, like, hey, if markets are good, we should have markets for government, and reasons to think the incentives will line up. But I think one of the things is that objectivists failed to do, if you're thinking about persuasion, is when one side is constantly making an argument and you don't take the time to answer them. Objectivists historically had answered them in like a very high level, here's one essay to address your claims. And then young people said, well, you haven't addressed XYZ arguments. And their kind of implication was, oh, you don't have answers to that. And I think only in the last few years have we been much more aggressive about really trying to lay out in detail, and for people who weren't convinced by the few paragraphs Ayn Rand wrote on anarchism, why we think it's a really wrong and anti-freedom view. And so I think one lesson there is like, even if you think a view is disreputable, if it's gaining traction among people who are weighing your views in a marketplace of ideas, you should probably take the time to address them. It doesn't necessarily, and address them doesn't mean say, yeah, these are reputable and let's have a friendly debate. You can say these are disreputable ideas, but if they're giving arguments that are confusing people, I think they really deserve an answer. And I don't think that was done for a long time. And I think it allowed, I don't think this is the only explanation, but I think, we dropped the ball in part and made this sort of situation. Well, Mark, good luck to you in fighting the fight. I really appreciate taking the time for this conversation.